Well, thank you for waiting. You all right, John?
So it's a bit wonky, but I'm sorry about it. It's the first time.
Yeah, it's a matter of putting the right bit in the right.
Yeah.
I don't know, whatever. Okay. Thank you all for coming. I hope that if any of you haven't yet been to Harvard House to see the Stratford Heritage Exhibition, you will go before the end of next Sunday when it finishes. So we've had an amazing response, nearly 7,000 people been through the door so far, and most of them have said how wonderful it is. I haven't actually come across anybody who said they didn't like it, but yeah, maybe they wouldn't tell me. Okay, so after a bit of a wait, but we hope we've got there, we've got Nikki Pearson talking to us about Suffragettes. What I would like to say, get here and read it. Some of you may have heard of Marie Corelli, who is a bit of a fan of mine. And she wrote in 1919 that she had previously been strongly opposed to votes for women. But the events of the First World War had changed her mind because all the men had gone off and all the women had, filled all the places in the factories and the fields and everything and kept the whole country going. And she wrote, "It was and is no longer possible to deny their equal rights with men in every relation of life and every place of work. By every law of justice, they should have the vote." So she completely changed her mind because of the First World War and because of what women were forced into. But she was talking in favour of the suffragists. Nikki is going to tell us all about the difference between the gis and the jets. So without any further ado, please welcome Mrs. Pearson.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Sorry for the technical delay. So I was lucky enough to be a recipient of the Louis Mulder Shakespeare scholarship, and I received that in 2024, and I spent a year looking at connections between Shakespeare and the suffragettes. And my discoveries, though, took me beyond all of that. There is so much more I hope I'll be able to tell you. But I'm aware that this society is not about Shakespeare. So my talk this evening might mention Shakespeare once or twice, but we'll focus on suffragettes and Stratford-on-Avon. Okay. Next slide, please.
Yeah. Got some cursing now. No.
Pressing the arrow, John. You can do that.
There's the arrow. Which version?
If you press the arrows to the left and the right, that will do it.
No, wrong way. It's all right. Grandchildren.
Yeah. You can do the enter button. That should work as well. Obviously not.
Oh yeah. How's that?
There we go.
What did you do, really?
Press the enter button.
Okay.
So in 1906, a reporter for the Daily Mail used the term suffragette to mock the women fighting for the vote. However, the Women's Social and Political Union, the WSPU, headed by Mrs. Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel, adopted the term suffragettes, and it became the term used to distinguish between the militants, the suffragettes, and the non-militants, the suffragists. Now, when you do research, you will find that particularly newspaper reporters and various other people, myself probably included, do get themselves a bit longer. So you might be looking at something from the 1900s and it will talk about suffragettes when it means suffragists and suffragettes when it means... Anyway, there is a distinction, and if you can remember, it helps. So there were over 40 groups for women's suffrage. because they were very democratic little souls, and basically if they disagreed with somebody, they then went and set up their own. But the main ones were the previously mentioned WSPU. They were militant, and they had an autocratic management system, which I think is quite ironic considering that they were working towards democracy, but never mind. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which was headed by Millicent Fawcett, sought the vote by peaceful means. They petitioned, lobbied MPs and private members to get them to put bills through the Houses of Parliament. And they did a lot of work before the Pankhursts jumped up and down and started making a lot of noise, and a lot of work after the Pankhursts had secured the vote for some women. And then there was the Women's Freedom League. This was led by Charlotte Despard. This was militant, but didn't agree with the non-democratic way that the WSPU was run. Next slide, please. So women have been seeking the vote since 1832. It would be 86 years before they were able to vote in parliamentary elections, and another 10 before it was the same terms for men as for men. So what was stopping them? Well, it was believed by some that women and men had separate spheres of biological determined gender roles. Women were homemakers and child carers. Men looked after business and politics. It was believed that women were too emotional and indecisive, that women's views were already represented by the men in their household, so they didn't need to vote, and that women were not interested in politics. Next slide, please. So, I'm sure these are pictures you may have seen before. In 1907, there was a women's suffrage group formed here in Stratford-on-Avon. In just over a year, it gained over 50 members. I have found no evidence that they were ever militant. What they did was they hosted at homes meetings in their front rooms where no men and no press were permitted. They gathered signatures for petitions. They sold badges and postcards at the shop that they had in Wood Street, which you can see in the photo over there. They attended meetings to speak up for women's suffrage, and they hosted open meetings where the speakers came from other groups, usually from Birmingham, that's the nearest. And the lady you see here is Helen Fraser. She's speaking at Southcroft. And as you can see, her audience is not huge, and it is not all female. It's quite a few gentlemen in that one. Next slide, please. Mr. Asquith, bless you. Perhaps another reason why acquiring the vote was so difficult is this man here. Leader of the Liberal Party, Mr. Herbert Henry Asquith, he became Prime Minister in April 1908 and was not a friend of women's suffrage. Speaking at the Aberdeen Liberal Association in December 1909, Asquith was asked if he would withdraw his opposition to the enfranchisement of women. He said, "My answer must be, as it has been many times, in the negative. I am prepared to withdraw my opposition the moment I am satisfied of two things, but not before. Namely, first, that the majority of women desire to have a parliamentary vote, and next, that the conferring of a vote upon them would be advantageous to their sex and the community at large." Next slide, please. So, in June 1908, Mr. Asquith got a response. 10,000 women joined a procession through the streets of London, including the ladies of Stratford-on-Avon. There were 15 marching bands and representatives of women from all levels of society. There were about 800 banners. These depicted famous women or symbolised the group they represented. The Stratford Herald reported Miss Rathbone, secretary of the Stratford group, carried a black and yellow banner with the words "to be" in prominent letters and "or not to be" in smaller letters underneath. Next slide, please. Sadly, despite my best efforts, and believe you me, I have looked at hundreds of photographs, not only in the Birthplace Trust, but also in the Women's Library in London and online, and I cannot find an image of that bag. I know it was hung outside the committee rooms in Chapel Street in 1909 and may have been outside the shop in Wood Street. By 1911, the group appears to have lost it. But from a leaflet we know on how you make that, we can tell that it was about 3 foot 2 inches tall by about 4 foot 6 inches long. So, could you go home and look in the and in your cellars and your... It's got to be somewhere. I would love it if anyone has a photograph of it, because I can't. Next slide, please. So, January 1909, there was a meeting of the NUWSS in Tyler Street, and the speaker was a Miss Taylor. She was from Birmingham, from the main office in Birmingham, and she put forward this proposal. This proposal was also being put forward in meetings across the country. What she's asked was that this meeting of working women urged the government to introduce the question of enfranchisement of women into the King's Speech and to give facilities for the passing of the bill in the coming season. It was, as were many other proposals of the same, across the country, carried unanimously. I'm not quite sure how this all then got reported back somewhere, but it will have been then, numbers will have been counted and it will have been presented to the government. Now, the King's Speech is an interesting thing because Asquith government had promised the suffragettes that it would be something in that speech. What tended to happen was the suffragettes would gather outside 10 Downing Street or outside the Houses of Parliament, and they would petition to have an opportunity to speak with the government. And when they got an opportunity, which was very rarely, but when they did, they would ask and ask again for this to be included. And Mr. Asquith would agree that it would happen, and the suffragettes would then ease off on their militant behaviour. So you can imagine. Next slide, please. A month later, Edward VII delivers his speech. It includes many reforms, and there's some listed here for you to see, but it does not include votes for women, as Asquith had promised. You can imagine they were a little irritated. However, they still got some publicity that day. An Australian suffragette named Muriel Matters, who was known for her somewhat adventurous nature, tried to fly a hot air balloon over the Houses of Parliament. You can see it's pictured here with votes for women across it. Unfortunately, the wind was in the wrong direction. But it did get publicity, it did get some press. Next slide, please. So, April, same year, 1909, and Stratford presents an opportunity for the women's suffrage societies to hit back at Asquith and his Liberal Party. This delightful gentleman, as pictured in Vanity Fair here, is Captain Thomas Malcolm Harvey Kincaid Smith. He is the Liberal MP for Stratford upon Avon. And in April 1909, he resigned his seat. He had a thing about compulsory military training for all men, and he was so obsessed with this idea that he decided he'd give up his seat and then stand again as an independent on that matter. So it forced a by-election, and the suffragists and suffragettes selected the town of Stratford-on-Avon and its surrounding villages as a battlefield. Next slide, please. As an example of cooperation sometimes demonstrated by the different suffrage organisations, WSPU, the NUWSS and the WFL sent full-time staff members to Stratford to support the local suffragists with the campaign. They were here for 3 weeks. And they held meetings in the town and the surrounding villages. You probably can't see the text on the far side, but that is just a list of all the meetings that took place in 1 week. There were as many as 14 meetings a day, and some of them lasted as long as 2 hours. They were campaigning under the title, "What We Want and Why We Want It." Reports suggested the women were winning support. Now, this is from a report in the Suffragette newspaper. It was written, a Studley man said, "They have quite won people's hearts, and I believe the people are going to back them." A clergyman's wife in one place told their reporter that the whole village had become suffragettes since the meeting had been held there. Mind you, the report also says that Joseph Archie's chestnut tree is in Wellesbourne. So maybe we can't rely too much on this. So visitors coming to the town for the annual Shakespeare Festival, which was taking place at the same time, and also lasted for 3 weeks, were unable to avoid the suffrage campaign. The chalked messages about meetings were on the pavements, the banner was outside the shop, and numerous campaign badges were being bought and worn by everyone, which kept the campaign in the public eye. Next slide, please. At the Corn Exchange in Stratford, in front of a crowd of 1,500 people, and this is according to the Stratford Herald, Christabel Pankhurst was the speaker. I like to think she was in that fog, but I don't think she was. She said she'd visited the birthplace, the grammar school and the church. She said she had read the papers and someone had suggested there would be 2 performances of Much Ado About Nothing in Stratford that evening, one at the theatre and one at the Corn Exchange. Christabel declared, "Let them see what that nothing is. Is the play the nothing about which there is much ado? Or was a woman's honour and reputation the much ado in that meeting connected with the struggle for women's rights and liberation?" Next slide, please. On the 23rd of April, Shakespeare's birthday, the Morning Post noted, "Today, Stratford has given politics a rest. And though a conveyance inscribed votes for women was seen in town, the ladies in it were bound for a meeting 2 miles away." Although the suffragettes were holding numerous meetings out of town, they didn't hold any in town on Shakespeare's birthday. They chose instead to join in the festivities. A special correspondent reported the most conspicuous figures in the picturesque procession were undoubtedly the band of suffragettes, recognised on all sides by the purple, white and green. They carried bouquets in the colours, and when in the Shakespeare address, Mr. Whitehall Reid quoted Milton with "We must be free to die," I saw that it was with difficulty the women restrained themselves from cheering. Miss Helen Fraser, Miss Gardner, which were all members from Birmingham NUWSS, were invited to the Stratford's Mayor and Mayoress's reception. They reported, "Everyone was telling us the town was quite won over. There was speculation as to Shakespeare's attitude on women, suffrage and sundry quotations. Our yellow and black banner with its to be or not to be excites notice outside our committee room." Next slide, please. On polling day, there were suffragettes at every polling booth. A newspaper reported seeing the NUWSS inviting the electors to sign a petition in favour of a law for the enfranchisement of their sex. The WSPU urged electors to keep the Liberal out at any cost, while the WFL went so far to ask voters to sign cards to the Prime Minister to the effect that they had voted against the government because of its attitude towards their cause. That's an example of the card out there. This is actually the general election in London, but I imagine that something similar was happening outside our town hall. Not all the reporting of the women's activities that day was positive. The Midland Daily Telegraph reported that on polling day, representatives of the various women's rights organisations were present outside polling booths, where each had its own way of doing business. In response to the WFL and their postcards, one gentleman said he was blonde. Another that he had forgotten his spectacles and would not offend Mr. Asquith with illegible handwriting. And one got into an altercation with Edith Craig. He stormily refused, saying he would rather give 100 votes to the Liberal candidate. At the town hall polling stations, party workers were objecting to the tactics employed by the suffragettes and wanted to eject them from the porch. The ladies stood their ground. The following day, the Daily Telegraph had more reports of discord. It reported what it called a humorous incident. A heated squabble between rival sections of the suffragists outside a polling station. The militant suffragettes with their postcards were in the porch, while the older and decorous suffragist organisation were outside with their petitions ready for signature. At loggerheads, one lot alleged that the other were querying our pitch. The report concludes that during the altercation, some nice and womanly things were said, to the intense amusement of the beholden. The results were announced the day after polling. Mr. Foster, the Conservative Unionist candidate, had won. Asquith's Liberal candidate lost. How much influence the ladies had on the result is hard to determine, as there were many more general factors, including budget and trade reform, that might have influenced the voters. However, the WSPU claimed it as a great success, declaring a victory in turning out a Liberal who would not offer full support to the women's vote. Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, who was also in Stratford over those 3 weeks and is deputy to the Pankhursts, she wrote, "While upon the stage of the Shakespeare Memorial Theatre, the great battles which have made famous the name of the English-speaking peoples were being played, outside in the streets of the town and away in outlying villages and hamlets, the modern political contest was going on, in which we, the WSPU, have learned to take our part." Next slide, please. With the by-election concluded, the well-known celebrity suffragettes returned to their offices in London and Birmingham, leaving the local suffragists to continue to raise awareness of the cause with the local population and visitors to Stratford. However, they were not alone. There was in the town some opposition to votes for women. As has been mentioned, Marie Corelli had written a booklet in 1907 titled "Women or Suffrage? A Question of Natural Choice." So at that point, she was clearly not a fan. And a public meeting was held at the Corn Exchange in 1912, organised by the National League for Opposing Women's Suffrage. My research is still ongoing, and I've yet to find out a little more about what was said at that meeting. Slides, next slide, please. Suffragettes were back in Stratford in 1911. It was filled with suffragettes and suffragists. It was chosen as the location for a peaceful demonstration by the women's suffrage groups of the Midlands. 500 members attended with banners and flags. This is how I know Stratford hasn't got one by then. It's not listed as a society with a flag. There were speeches on 3 platforms in Rother Street. Lady Selborne and Lady Willoughby de Brooke were among the speakers. The route, as they marched about, went from Rother Street down Chestnut Walk, along Church Street, Chapel Street and High Street, turned into Bridge Street, Guild Street, and then went down Henley Street and Wood Street. Next slide, please. In 1913, frustrated by more broken promises from the government, the NUWSS organised a national pilgrimage, encouraging members to march from all points of the country to finish in Hyde Park in London. Militancy was at its height, and they wanted to draw a distinction between their constitutional campaign and the militancy of the WSPU. On the 16th of July, 56 pilgrims who had started their march in Carlisle in the Lake District reached Stratford-upon-Avon. They went to Holy Trinity, laid a wreath on Shakespeare's grave, followed by a procession around the town led by the Leamington Band. The day did not end well. The parade concluded at the fountain at 8 p.m, where a vast crowd awaited the women. The Stratford-on-Avon Herald reports, Mrs. Hanbury was given a fair hearing, but on making way for Miss Aston, the unruly sprites in the crowd began to assert themselves, and there was a continual run of booing, jeering, and catcalling. The mob surged to and fro in the proximity of the conveyance from which the speeches were made, and several ladies in the audience were roughly treated. One individual who was making himself unduly prominent was escorted out of the crowd by police. But the noise and din went on unceasingly, and it was evident that the noisy element were determined that the ladies should not obtain a hearing. They were successful in this, and eventually suffragists abandoned the meeting. It was believed that many of the opposition came from Leamington for the fun, having disrupted the meeting there the previous evening. Next slide, please. So, how did this all end? Between 1914 and 1960, the focus for women changed as they became more involved in the war work. In August 1916, Asquith announced he might be persuaded of the cause for women's suffrage. Perhaps he'd been talking to Mary Corelli. He stood down as PM in the December that year. The Representation of the People Act received royal assent on the 6th of February 1918. It granted the vote to all men over 25 and to women over 30 who were occupiers or wives of occupiers of landlord premises with an annual value of no less than £5. Oh, and women over 30 who were university graduates. They were also able to stand for Parliament. But it would be another 10 years before women had the vote on the same terms as men. Next slide, please. Groups in Stratford began to diversify. By 1913, a Miss East of Fairview was secretary of a branch of the WSPU. Yes, there was the WSPU here in Stratford. Also, the Conservative and Unionist Women's Franchise Association was very successful in attracting women members. And Miss Flowerdew Lowson of Snitterfield House was secretary of the Stratford sub-branch. Little is reported about the speeches made by these many Stratford women who made most of their speeches in drawing rooms, many closed to the press and public. After the 1909 by-election, they continued to hold drawing room meetings, and even though a WSPU branch was opened in Stratford in 1910, there's no evidence of militant activity. I found more evidence of suffrage activity in Leamington Spa. Their meetings were more public and reported in the local press in more detail. The historian and writer Mary Dormer Harris was a member and regularly wrote to the editor of the Courier on the subject of women's suffrage. One such incident of note was just after the by-election here in Stratford, one when the ladies were all parading about. Edith Craig was the speaker at the WFL meeting in the Pump Rooms in Leamington. She accused the Dean of St Albans of painting Shakespeare's heroines as anti-suffragettes in his sermon at the Shakespeare's service in Holy Trinity. He'd merely suggested that Shakespeare's heroines were exemplars for all time of what a true woman should be, accepting their limitations fixed by God and nature, but they should not be laying wreaths and waving flags. Craig claimed Shakespeare as a supporter of their movement and his heroines as terribly independent women and a lesson to suffragettes of what was truly womanly in women. The reporter for the Courier suggested their views were not so far apart, but the platform and the pulpit have evidently different plots. So why then were these ladies of Stratford and Leamington not more active in the movement for suffrage? Maybe they were all very nice people and didn't like doing anything illegal. But I suggest that the answer lies in the geography of the suffragette movement as a whole. Most activity took place in cities and industrial centres, with Birmingham being the biggest nearest to Stratford. It is here we find full-time suffrage society staff and plenty of evidence of military activities, of militant activities. Rural market towns are not without groups and even offices, but they remain focused on gathering signatures on petitions and hosting the occasional meeting when one of the suffrage society's main players comes to speak. Stratford has moments of glory when it is the centre of activity during the by-election and when the Midland branch office in Birmingham identifies the town as a good spot for a demonstration march, and when it is one of the many stop-offs on the suffrage pilgrimage to London. Activities all organised and led by Birmingham or London personnel. Between times, it slips quietly back into the genteel activities of before. Thank you.
Thank you. Somebody must want to know. I mean, look at those. Catherine Boyden. Is that the same Boyden who was in charge of the newspaper? Yes. Yeah. Mrs. Salt Glassington. Now, Salt Glassington ran the archive at the SCT. So these, some of these women, not exactly stringing violets. Yes. I don't know whether Miss Middleton had anything to do with that front of Middleton. I've never understood that, but Cameron Stewart, that's another name I recognise. Georgina Burney, yes, Compton Burney, Georgina Burney. So, Catherine Scriven, that's another name that I've come across.
Most of these names I've found because they published the meetings, those front room at homes, and they have to give the name and address, so people don't know where to go. So That's where you pick up a lot of the names, but they really were very well behaved.
That's a real shame. Yeah, Paul.
Thank you very much, Nikki. Packed with information, beautifully researched. Thank you. I don't see a flower name. Can you tell us about the flower family and suffrage, please?
Well,
No flower power. Yes.
I have looked and I haven't found any connection that links the Flower family to the suffrage, apart from one. One of the young lads of the Flower family was sent to Liverpool to stay with a family while he was at school. And the name of the family was Rathbone. And the Rathbones of Liverpool were very, very much into suffrage. So whether he brought that back, I think it was Charles, whether he brought this back and then shared it with his family, I don't know.
Thank you.
The flowers were very anti-slavery, weren't they? Rather than, you know, for women as such. I think they were probably just more general, you know, human beings rather than men and women. Yeah.
Just
Yeah,
to make
sorry.
a couple of observations. I'm just wondering, Miss Bullard, now the Bullard family were quite a leading Quaker family in that period in Stratford-upon-Avon, and I don't know whether that is any connection, I'm guessing, because most of the other names on there seem quite posh. I'm not being criticising in that sense, but they seem to be people of. And the other question that I'll ask the speaker is, have you had a look in the Herald during the weeks preceding the 1918 election? And the reason I ask that is I did an essay some years ago on the Kingston-on-Thames by-election of 1918. And in fact, the Women's Freedom League had meetings with all the three candidates, the Conservative, the Liberal Unionists, and also the new Labour candidate who stood for the first time. And they did a panel on separate evenings where they asked the same questions, and the Surrey Comet actually produced, in fairness to them, over a 2-week period, all the answers which the candidates gave. And it was quite reflective as to what the women's ideology was in the 1918 election in that part of the world, which is Surrey.
Certainly that approach was also taken here in Stratford. I mean, they only had 3 candidates. They only had Mr. Foster, Mr. Martin, and Mr. Kincaid-Smith. And Kincaid-Smith would not be drawn because he was focused on his military training. Mr. Foster, who was one, was he? He was very good at sitting on the fence. And the other, the Liberal candidate was no, don't talk about it. So they did try talking to them. The successful candidate was very positive after he was elected and thanked the women, which I assume he meant his wife, but he sort of was very general in his thanking the women for their support. He wrote to them because they asked him where he stood, and he said yes, he would support it. But when the paper then, the next paper came up in the House, he actually withdrew his support. So he withdrew his support and said he couldn't support it any longer because of the militant act. He's used that as his excuse for changing his.
Jenny, do you have a question?
It was just an observation really. When we first moved to Stratford, I actually joined the local Women's Liberation Group, which used to meet at the Oddfellows, which was really one of them. Kind of carry on from Suffragettes. And today, as a result of all this movement, we have our very first female MP for Stratford, which has taken an awfully long time to get from when women first started actually wanting to actually be able to get in there. But which is really nice.
It just proves that all you've got to do is to keep going and going and going, and you get there eventually. You can get surrounded about it. Anybody else got any more questions? Yes. John.
thank you for the talk. May I put a speculation to you? The speculation is that if we had been at that time in the era of communications as we have today, and polling was a matter of course as it is today, my speculation is that there would not have been support in this period in the early 19th century for women's suffrage. Certainly not if the poll was of men, and I think probably not if the poll also was of women. Now, you may shoot that speculation down because it's not born out of any particular deep knowledge of the subject. But if it's anywhere near a reasonable speculation, my question is this: to what extent do you think that the movement was successful was due to the violence as opposed to the non-violent efforts of the suffragists? Please.
Yeah, I think it's when you talk to anyone about women's suffrage, this is an area where everyone has a view, and sometimes a very different view. I ask myself, would I have been a suffragette? I'm pretty sure I'd have been a suffragist, but I'm not sure how far I would be willing to go, and whether I would break the law or not. And I think there are, people who feel that these women were terrorists. They claim that they were not intending to hurt people and that they only bombed houses that were empty. But if you were the Prime Minister and you had a house where you would go at the weekend, that house wasn't empty. It would have servants in it. It would have staff in it. So I'm not convinced they were that caring about lower class people.
Can I just say, I think the real turning point was the war, and it was the women's effort in the war. How could you then return and, sit on your bum, as they were told to do, go back and be quiet? I believe one woman was told it was the war effort and women's involvement. I think they did more than total violence of suffragettes.
I mean, Millicent Fawcett's operation was the non-militant. They worked very, very hard for a very long time. They spoke to politicians. They would talk to them and put their point of view across, and they would work very hard trying to change the opinion of people and doing it without necessarily violence. And you just have to ask yourself, well, was it a case of the others, Pankhurst and their lot, were they just frustrated by all this and decided that this wasn't going to change anything and that they needed to do something more drastic?
It's true. I think that's how they came about. And I think we've gone on battling for some time. If they had been involved in the during the First World War, I think that was the turning point really.
Yeah, I think
they got panicked. They just had to give it away.
It's
It's a shame it was such a poor do, but it got started.
I think they got frustrated. I think, and also Christabel was, the way that she operated. This was, it was her way or no way, basically. And she made that decision, and she ran it like a military operation. And I think that's why we had what we had. And then there is an escalation. They don't start bombing houses. They start firing lead boxes and post boxes. And then they build up with more and more as they get more and more frustrated. But there were a lot of MPs, like our Stratford MP, who said, "Oh, hang on a minute, I can't support that."
Yes, it did. It did do damage.
Well,
were the suffragettes active after the First World War?
Well, they became during the war. They
After the war,
and then after the war they went back to.
right.
But once the 18 Reform Act was brought in, and the older, the 30-year-old women with property were able to vote. Tanglers just stopped. They didn't do any more after that. They've done what they wanted to do. It was Millicent Fawcett and her people that kept going to get full equality. And because it was Millicent and the non-militant approach, it took another 10 years.
I was just wondering whether, the government was able to give, was able to move in the right direction. Because they didn't want to be seen to be giving into, what was actually terrorism, as you said. And they said they were doing it because of the contribution that we made during the war.
Yeah, that's certainly aspects.
Yeah.
You've proved yourself now, ladies. Yes, you can have the vote.
Anybody else? Right, well, thank you very much, Nikki. That's, if anybody is interested, there's stuff at the back there, including a very interesting picture that Cal brought of the a meeting.
That's the 1913.
Yes, yeah.
The which was the pilgrims, and they were going down in Robert.
So do have a look before he goes. And we have. Would you like to give us your advert now?
Thank you. Thanks very much for your talk. Really interesting. Yes, thank you for this opportunity. I'd just like to draw your attention to an upcoming talk that's taking place in the Guild Chapel on October the 14th. It's being given by Pamela Devine, who some of you might recall gave a very interesting talk here to members about the graffiti on the Guild Chapel walls. Her new talk is about the painting on the south wall on the Guild Chapel, which is currently hidden by panelling. And she's talking about how this painting foretells the story of Noah and the flood. And her talk's going to reveal some very rarely seen images of this painting because the panelling was taken down a couple of years ago for some conservation work and research and photographs to be taken. So this will be part of her talk. So I think it's going to be very interesting. And it's also part of quite an exciting programme of talks and events that are leading up to the community production of Noah's Ark, which is taking place next year in the Guild Chapel. So if you're interested and would like to come along, her talk is October the 14th at 6:30 in the evening, and that's at the Guild Chapel. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much again, Nikki.